I've been thinking about the power of slowing down the way we digest information. A friend and I have been working our way through Oliver Burkeman's newest book. It's called Meditations for Mortals. It's broken into short little sections, each one about something specific to think about. It feels pretty familiar. In many ways, it's the same format as what I send out to you each week in my emails. If you're not signed up for those, you can sign up at gothinkabout.com, and I send out just one short little question each week. But what's interesting is that because it's in a book format and not something that shows up weekly in my inbox, you have it all in front of you at once. So it's up to the reader to decide how to interact with it. And my natural impulse was to sit down and devour it, as that's what I tend to do with books. But this particular book is broken up into 28 days worth of readings, and the subtitle is 4 Weeks to Embrace Your Limitations and Make Time for What Counts. The intention is clear. You read one meditation a day for 28 days. Now, it's my book. I can do what I want with it. But a friend and I decided we'd set ourselves a goal of a certain number of readings and that we'd book a time to discuss those few on an agreed-upon date before moving forward. If you haven't done something like this before, it's a really fun way to spark discussion into areas you may or may not naturally converse with friends. And it's also a fun way to tackle reading a longer, nonfiction type book where you both likely get really different takeaways from it, or where it can feel overwhelming because these kinds of books can be very dense information-wise. I've also found you read differently and even take notes or journal in a different way when you know you're going to be discussing something later. There's often a bit more depth to it. Not in a homeworky or an academic kind of way, but just in a recording whatever sparks in your brain upon first reading kind of way, because you'll likely forget by the time you're chatting about it. Doing it this way has been a really interesting experience for a number of reasons and has had me thinking about quite a few things. I've been thinking about how I read books. So my instinct when I sit down with a book is usually to pull a Netflix and binge the whole thing at once for nonfiction or over a few days, depending on how long it is, because I do like me a good long book. Or it might be to binge a whole series of books in a row if it's fiction. But to just read the whole book pretty much as quickly as my available time will allow. I've always been a fast reader, and I take in information quickly. I'm also not very good at stopping and starting things. Once I'm into it and I'm in the flow, it's really hard to stop. So this has been really great practice at self-control and self-discipline, and also has had the benefit of giving me time to really mull things over and dig a little deeper into the ideas. I've also been thinking about how long I actually need to apply an idea in my life. Once I slowed down and settled into the pace and let the discomfort fade away, I actually found that not only was I enjoying the limitation of only reading one a day, actually even one every day felt like too much. I think I'd actually like to spend a week on each of the ideas and see how they play out over the course of several days. Give it time to actually lean into each concept before another one is layered on. I've also been thinking about the benefits of reading slower and more intentionally. One serious upside is that you don't go through as many books. For me, this is definitely a budget issue, and it can really help extend the enjoyment as well when a new book by an author I love comes out. Because we usually don't get more than about one a year from an author, sometimes one every few years in the nonfiction world. As an author, I also appreciate this slower pace because when I spend a year or 3 writing a book and then it's consumed instantly and then immediately set aside, people start asking about the next one. And while it's lovely that people want more from me, that's also a bit both disheartening and overwhelming. I've also been thinking about retention of information in a sea of content. Even with great content, it can be washed away in the river of information flowing past us before even a week has elapsed. Heck, we're lucky if it even lasts the day or the hour. We can't retain these huge amounts of information we so quickly consume these days. We usually only remember 1 to 3 main messages from any given article or book that we read, and at least one of those three is usually the last thing we read. This is called the recency effect. Think of it like your brain creating a condensed version of the most relevant concepts for you from each session, and then capping it off with whatever the final line was because the author must have saved the best for last. But what if I break up that experience into smaller chunks and remember 1 to 3 main messages from each chapter instead of from the whole book? Well, that seems like it could make a seriously impactful difference over a longer period of time, or a book that had many variable but important concepts in it. And I love the idea of integrating and testing each idea before adding in another, so I know which ones really made an impactful change. After all, for good experiments to yield useful information, we don't want to change too many variables at once, right? It's just like science class. You got to change one thing at a time. I'm playing around with this concept in my own creative work. It's why you get only one podcast episode a week. It was interesting to me after I launched how many people said, "Oh, they're really short. You could do new ones 2 to 3 times a week." And yes, at least in theory, I could likely make that happen. But if I did, it would give me way less time to think about each of the ideas I'm sharing with you. So I think the depth wouldn't be there in the same way. It would also mean that you were trying to go think about 3 times as many things each week just from this one source, which I don't actually think would be doing either of us any favors. So we're going to stick with weekly as it gives us all more room to experiment and see what yields results, and maybe even make an alteration or two to what we're doing before we move on to trying the next thing. In the spirit of trying an experiment with just one thing, I would invite you to take a look around your life and think about where there's something you're doing that you could do a little bit slower, or maybe in smaller chunks to increase the value and satisfaction you're getting from that activity. Can you think of something like that? Okay, well, since you have a whole week until the next episode, why don't you go ahead and test that out? Try slowing it down a little and just see what happens. I'm going to leave you with a few questions to ponder as you conduct your experiment. And if you want to have these as journaling questions to refer to, you can find them in the show notes as well. How do you feel about that shift of slowing that thing down? Did it make you uncomfortable? And if so, why do you think that is? If it did make you uncomfortable, was it the good kind of uncomfortable, in that it was leading to change and you've learned something important about yourself? How about the people around you? How did they experience this shift, and how do they feel about it? And hint, don't just make assumptions, because we're rarely right about how other people are feeling about things or what they're actually thinking. Go ahead and ask them, have a conversation, bring them into the process. Are there any hidden gifts in that exchange or experience or approach that you're not seeing, but someone else can point out for you? Thanks for listening to Go Think About with Crystal Hunt, the podcast where we keep it real, keep it human, and keep it honest. Before you take off, please remember to hit the follow or subscribe button in whatever app you're listening to the show. It'll help you stay on top of when those new weekly episodes are released, and it'll help me stay motivated to keep on creating, knowing that you're out there listening. Until next week, remember to breathe and take it just a little bit slower.